So before we get into actual scheduling algorithms themselves, what we want to talk about is scheduling criteria. Because if we have different algorithms, what we need to do is have some way to judge which one is the best, right? We need to have some metrics. So we have a few things we're going to look at. There's kind of these 5 things here. Let's look at these one by one. All of these, again, are going to be ways that we can use to basically judge whether an algorithm is good for us or not. So first thing we have is the idea of CPU utilization. CPU utilization is basically a measure of, this is how much, how often the CPU is busy, right? So if you have, say, something like, the CPU is 50% utilized, that means that we're only using it like 50% of the time. Okay, this is our first metric. Now, in general, this won't be too useful, though, because, you can just queue up a bunch of stuff, right? Your CPU is always going to be working on something. Usually, CPU utilization isn't something that's too hard, right, to max out. The only time you kind of have an issue with it is maybe if you have a bunch of programs that maybe are I/O bound, right, and you don't need CPU time. But even in that case, there's no point in maxing out your CPU because your CPU, isn't even necessary. Second thing we have is throughput. So throughput is basically the idea of, I have a bunch of programs running on my computer. How many can I complete over a certain interval of time? And this is kind of a much more kind of useful number. A lot of people do use this, right? Basically, if I have a system that needs to service a ton of things, what I want to do is I want to implement something that has a high throughput. The caveat on this one is that we need to be very careful about how we kind of measure things, because throughput is defined basically in terms of like an amount of time. So I need to pick my interval smartly, right? Do I care about how many things completed in a minute or an hour or whatever, right? Because sometimes you can imagine there's a little bit of an issue in that if you say, hey, I'm going to let my period be really long, well then of course your throughput's going to become artificially high, right? Or if you make it really short, then your throughput's going to become unnaturally low as well. The next one we have, right, turnaround time. Turnaround time is kind of a big one. Turnaround time is basically the time it takes for me to complete a process, right? So when I want basically to say, I have your process A, B, C, D, right? I want them all to complete, right? That's what turnaround time is, right? So it's the time they spend in waiting plus the time they spend to actually do their own execution, because those may be different things, right? And so we're kind of adding them together. Turnaround time is something very typical, and it's actually been one of the metrics we use in order to judge the algorithms we'll talk about. The fourth one we have there is waiting time. So waiting time is kind of like part of turnaround time. Basically what it's measuring is, this is all the time up until when the process gets to run. So there's kind of this block of time there, right, where the process isn't doing anything. How much are we wasting? In an ideal system, right, waiting time would be 0, right, meaning our processes are never, sitting there in the queue just waiting around. But, just because we have this system, right, where there's multiple processes running, well, for sure there's going to be something kind of ahead of us, right? Maybe that first process that gets to run will have waiting time 0, but everything else is going to have to wait at least a little bit of time. So generally, somehow our waiting time is going to look like, our turnaround time is going to look like our waiting time plus how long the processes take to run. The last thing we have there is response time. And this is something that's going to be kind of very, very hard for us to, it may be hard for us to measure, but it's something that kind of in a real world scenario is very useful. So response time is basically how long does it take for our processes to actually, do something useful, right, or respond to the user. Because from the user's point of view, maybe you have things running. Well, if I don't actually get a result back, do they really care or not, right? Typically they don't, right? They don't care that their program got 50% of all the CPU cycles over the last 10 seconds, unless that resulted in them getting an update on the screen, right, or some answer they wanted, right? Unless you actually have something to store for it, the user really doesn't care. And so that last one, right, is kind of trying to capture that, right? How long does it take for your processes to get back to you? That's something we can't really even measure, right? It's nice to know, but unless we know basically how that process works, it's going to be really, 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 really hard for us to actually measure what the response time is supposed to be. All right, so the last thing here we want to talk about, right, is this notion of kind of bounded waiting time. This is kind of just a thought question for you guys. Why is there something like bounded waiting time on this list? Well, the reason why it's not, right, is because somehow we're assuming that everything's going to work, right? So bounded waiting time, right, if you think back to process synchronization, bounded waiting time was something we introduced as kind of our wish list, right? These are the things that I want my algorithms to do, right, in order for them to work properly. Well, here we're not even talking about that because, hey, if I had a process that wasn't subject to bounded waiting time, well, then it would never complete. And then basically everything would just break, right? I somehow here I'm assuming that everything goes right, that my programs are able to run, they're able to complete. I'm not going to consider the issue, right, where they're, either they have to wait too long, right, or maybe they get stuck in some sort of, a deadlock. I'm going to assume that everything works here. The last kind of remark there, it's kind of in parentheses, right, is about a live algorithm. So somehow there's a note, right, that I have kind of my 2 classes of algorithms. So it's something that's either, a live algorithm, meaning it can run stuff as it sees it, or an offline algorithm, right? Something that needs to know all the processes in advance. Those 2 things are kind of they're very critical, right? And it's not really fair to call them, criteria per se. It's just like, they either work, an algorithm either works this way or it doesn't, right? It's either live or it's not, right? And based on our situation, we're kind of forced to, use one that's live or use one that's not live, right? There's not really an optimization there. It's just, if you have to use it, you have to use it. That's the end of it. Okay, so that's scheduling criteria. The next thing we want to talk about is all the different scheduling algorithms we might want to use.